Module 2, Lesson 1, Publications, Forms, and Records, Maintenance-Related Regulations. Today we're going to list and describe some important federal aviation regulations. We'll identify the regulation part number for the FAR, and we'll describe the applicability of the FARs and the regulations to you, the aircraft maintenance technician. We have many maintenance-related regulations in Title 14 of the Code of Federal Aviation Regulations. We'll start off with Part 1. Part 1 is going to give us some definitions and some abbreviations. It's a good starting point to look for. If you find a term that you're unsure of, go ahead and start at Part 1 and see if you can't find that definition or that abbreviation there. It's not all-inclusive, but like I said, it's a good starting point. You may find some additional definitions or abbreviations in the specific FAR you're looking for. Part 21 is the certification procedures for products and for parts. It's the first of the big three. It identifies the procedures for obtaining type certificates, supplemental type certificates, production certificates, airworthiness certificates, and important export and import approvals. Some of the other major areas covered in this part are authorization procedures for obtaining delegation options authorization, becoming a designated alteration station, a DAS, or obtaining a PMA, parts manufacturer approval, or authorization for related products for TSO, technical standard order. This FAR also requires us to have a complete set of ICAs or instruction for continued airworthiness. So if we change a part, if we do a modification to an aircraft, we need to make sure that we have ICAs in place, instructions for continued airworthiness, so whoever's maintaining the aircraft knows what needs to be done to keep the aircraft in an airworthy condition. Part 23, Airworthiness Standards for Normal, Utility, Aerobatic, Commuter Category Aircraft. This certifies general aviation from small trainers to corporate jets. It's going to provide standards for flight structure, design, construction, power plant, equipment, and operating limitations. Part 23 represents the greatest portion of what we in the industry refer to as general aviation. These are propeller-driven, piston-driven, turbine aircraft, corporate aircraft, transport business executive aircraft, seating limited to 9 or less on aircraft except for the commuter aircraft where maximum capacity is going to be 19 people. Part 23 has 6 subparts providing detailed criteria for the design of aircraft. The first, Part A, defines the applicability of this regulation. The others are flight, structure, design and construction, power plant, equipment, and operation limitations. Within each of these subparts, numerous sections specify details such as center of gravity, gust load factors, removable fasteners, shape of cockpit controls, what is the landing gear handle going to look like, what is the throttle going to look like, things of this nature. It's going to give us some engine and propeller requirements, fuel tank markings, what needs to be marked on the fuel tank on all aircraft, cockpit instrumentation, placarding, cabin aisle width, flammability, resistance standards. It's all part of 14 CFR Part 23. Part 25 are the airworthiness standards for transport category aircraft. Part 23 kept us at 12,500 pounds and below. Part 25 is actually going to certify larger aircraft which exceeds 12,500 pounds. Going to have some of the same requirements as we had in Part 23, but it's going to be more applicable to a larger type aircraft. 14 CFR Parts 27, 29, 33, and 35. We're going to continue on to Part 27, which is airworthiness standards for normal category rotorcraft. This regulation deals with small rotorcraft or rotor wing aircraft and is very consistent with Part 23, limiting passenger seating to 9 or less and a maximum certified takeoff weight of 7,000 pounds. Contains the same 6 subparts as identified in 23 and is going to provide the details for developing the aircraft. Part 29, Airworthiness Standards for Transport Category Rotorcraft. This part specifies those standards applicable to rotorcraft with a maximum certified weight of greater than 7,000 pounds, includes additional parameters based on the seating capacity and additional weight limits. Part 33 is the airworthiness standard for aircraft engines. It details requirements for both reciprocating and turbine-style engines, not only specifies the design and construction requirements, but also the block test requirements, subjecting engines to extreme demanding tests in order to prove their capability of enduring the stress of the powered aircraft. We want to make sure these aircraft engines are not going to fail in flight. And then to conclude, Part 35 are the airworthiness standards for propellers. Just as with the engines, the aircraft must also have a type certificate. Just as the engine must have a type certificate, the propeller must also be certified. This part is the same way as Part 33, and Subpart B specifies the design and construction, covers tests and inspections of the propellers. Part 39, Airworthiness Directives, or ADs as we like to refer to them in the field. The ADs are issued as amendments to Part 39 if the FAA determines a regular aircraft use has caused unanticipated wear or failure. They're going to do an AD on that particular aircraft, or an airworthiness directive. These airworthiness directives are going to give us some very specific information, specifically going to tell us what aircraft are affected, how long we can fly the airplane, or how long can we continue to fly the airplane, how long do we have to get this inspection or this repair done. It's all done in the name of safety. We want to make sure that the aircraft that are flying are as safe as we can possibly make them. ADs are going to have specific numbers to them. We'll get into those numbers as we get into a later lesson, but basically in a nutshell, the AD is going to be an 8-digit number. It'll start off with a year. So it might be 2000, 2001, it might be 2007. That's going to be the year that it was issued. The next part of the number is going to be a bi-weekly number, so it's going to be somewhere between 1 and 26. So if you had 2001 26, that would be the 26th bi-weekly period of 2001, and then the last two numbers are the actual in sequence order of when that AD was issued in that bi-weekly period. So if you had 2001-26-17, that would be the 17th AD issued in the 26th bi-weekly period of 2001. Part 43, Maintenance, Preventative Maintenance, Rebuilding, and Alterations. This is the second of the big three regulations. It's going to provide us some standards for aircraft maintenance, and probably the most important FAR for the maintenance technician. This FAR has 13 rules and 6 appendixes contained within Part 43. It's going to provide the standard for maintaining all 185,000 civilian aircraft currently registered in the United States. The entire Part 43 triangle lies to the right of the vertical line in Figure 12-5. Indicates its relationship to maintaining continued airworthiness. A more detailed explanation of this regulation is presented later on as we get further into the text. (14 CFR Part 45) Identification and Registration Markings. Part 45 identifies the requirements for the identification of aircraft, engines, propellers, and certain replacement parts or certain modification parts. The nationality and registration marking required on U.S. registered aircraft. All certified products must have the following information on a fireproof data plate or similarly approved fireproof method. So first we need to have the builder's name, the model designation, the builder's serial number, the type certificate number if applicable, production certificate number if applicable. For engines, we need to have the established rating, reference to compliance with 14 CFR Part 35, reference and compliance for exemption to 14 CFR Part 34, which is fuel venting and exhaust emissions for turbine-powered aircraft. And then last of all, the catch-all, any other information that the FAA deems appropriate for the specific aircraft is going to fall under Part 45. Replacement and modification parts which are produced in accordance with manufacturing approval, or PMA, parts manufacturer approval, must have the following information permanently and legibly marked. First off, we have to have FAA PMA. Then we have to have the name, symbol, or trademark of the holder of the PMA. We have to have the part number. We have to have the name and the model and designation for each type certified part which can be installed. If the part has a specific replacement time, if it is a time-limited part, we need to determine what the inspection intervals are. We need to have a related procedure or specification to maintain that particular part. We either need to have it added to the maintenance manual, or we have to have an instruction for continued airworthiness, an ICA, associated with the part and the serial number for each specific part. The nationality and registration marks, commonly known as the N number for U.S. registered aircraft, can vary in size depending on the year the aircraft was built or whether or not the aircraft has been repainted. Most common size is at least 12 inches in height. Smaller aircraft built at least 30 years ago, or replicas of these aircraft, or experimental exhibition or amateur built aircraft may use letters at least 2 inches high. Only a few aircraft are authorized to display registration marks of at least 3 inches. This regulation sits directly on the vertical line of part in figure 12-5, indicating it applies to both original and recurrent airworthiness standards. 14 CFR Part 47 and 65. Part 47, Aircraft Registration, provides the requirements for registering aircraft. It's going to include the procedures for both owners and for dealer registration of aircraft. Part 65 is the certification of airmen other than flight crew members. These rules are going to be for the certification of air traffic control tower operators, aircraft dispatchers, mechanics, repairmen, and parachute riggers. Part 65 gives a detailed description of what is required to be an aircraft mechanic, what type of experience is required, and is certainly worth further research. 14 CFR Parts 91 and 119. Part 91 are the general operating and flight rules. This is the third of the big three regulations. It focuses on recurrent airworthiness. Owners, operator pilots, and maintenance technicians must all be aware of Part 91. Subpart E is maintenance, preventative maintenance, and alterations, important for the maintenance technician. As we dig deeper into Part 91, we see that there's some specific rules on emergency locator transmitters. Part 91.207 gives us some specific information on battery replacement intervals, requirements for the logbook, things of this nature. Part 91.213 talks about inoperative instruments and equipment. Talks about the fact we have to have a letter of authorization from the Flight Standards District Office, or the FSDO, authorizing the operation of the aircraft under an MEL. We get into subpart E, that's maintenance, preventative maintenance, and alterations. This section is probably most interesting to us, the technician. We need to be familiar with it because this regulation carries some direct and some indirect responsibility for the technician. No person may perform maintenance or preventative maintenance or alterations on an aircraft other than as prescribed in this subpart or other applicable regulations, including Part 43 of this chapter. Part 119 is a certification of air carriers and commercial air carriers. This is going to define which regulations apply based on the carriage, the hire, and the status of the aircraft and the size of the aircraft. 14 CFR Part 121, 125, and 135. We're going to define additional operating and certification requirements. Part 121 is going to establish operating rules for air carriers flying for compensation or hire. It's going to include subparts for maintenance and preventative maintenance. going to include either turbojet aircraft or airplane having 10 or more passenger seats or a payload capacity of greater than 7,500 pounds. Part 120 operators are going to be required by Part 119 to have the following personnel. We're going to be required to have a director of safety, a director of operations, a director of maintenance, a chief pilot, and a chief inspector. There's 23 subparts and 15 appendixes on this regulation. However, only 2 of the subparts, J and L, are going to be of concern to us, the mechanic. Subpart J is maintenance, preventative maintenance, and alterations. It's going to identify special airworthiness requirements, which deals with many of the mechanic aspects of a passenger or cargo aircraft. And then subpart L is maintenance, preventative maintenance, and alterations required that a part of the 120 operator must have an operations manual which contains the following information. Going to have an organizational chart, a list of personnel who may perform required inspections, company maintenance and preventative maintenance alterations, and a system to both preserve and retrieve maintenance inspection related information. Part 125 applies to private carriage for hire and includes detailed operation specifications. Airplanes having a seating capacity of 20 or more passengers, having a maximum payload of 6,000 pounds or more, and rules governing persons aboard such aircraft. It's going to apply to private and non-common carriage when such operations are conducted on airplanes having 20 or more seats or have a payload, as I just said, of 6,000 pounds or more. Part 135, operating requirements, commuting, on-demand operations, and rules governing persons on board such aircraft. Applicable to short-distance commercial aircraft operations or commuters and non-scheduled carriers that operate on demand. These aircraft are frequently referred to as air taxis or air charter aircraft. 14 CFR Part 145 and 147. Part 145, repair stations. Repair stations can employ both certified and non-certified personnel, and repair stations must have a repair station manual that specifies procedures. Maybe of interest to note that you do not need to hold an airframe or power plant certification to be employed at a repair station. The repair station may employ both certified technicians and non-certified personnel in all work that is signed off and done so under the repair station certificate number. The repair station manual must contain an organizational chart, procedures for maintaining rosters, a description of housing facilities and equipment, a procedure for revising the capability list and conducting self-evaluation, procedures for revising the training program, and procedures for governing work done at another location. Must also include procedures for working on air carrier aircraft, description of work required records and record keeping, procedures for revising the repair station manual, and a description for the systems to identify and control sections of the manual. All records from the repair station activity must be kept a minimum of 2 years. Part 147, Aviation Maintenance Technician Schools. This outlines the requirements for obtaining an airframe and power plant certificate. This regulation is going to get into the hours required for training, the subjects that must be covered, and the skill level that the school must teach to each level. 14 CFR Part 183, Representatives of the Administrator. This allows the FAA to designate representatives from the private sector to act on its behalf. Designated engineer representatives, designated manufacturing inspection representatives, designated airworthiness representatives. Since 1962, the FAA has begun a program to allow private sector persons in various areas of industry to be designees or representatives of the FAA. These people are not FAA employees, but rather designated by the FAA to act on their behalf. People such as aviation medical examiners or pilot examiners that are skilled pilots in the field, or maintenance examiners. Typically your 147 schoolers are going to have a TPE, or technical personnel examiner, that's going to administer the oral and practical portion of the FAA exams. In summary, there are many maintenance-related regulations in 14 CFR. It's important technicians are familiar with these regulations. Parts 21, 23, 25, 27, 29, 33, 35, and 39 are going to define airworthiness standards for certifications for fixed wing, for rotor wing, for propellers, for engines. You're going to find them in those particular parts. Part 43 defines the maintenance and preventative maintenance and alteration. Probably one of the most important regulations to us, the aircraft technician. And we'll move on to Part 45 and 47 are going to define identification and registration for aircraft markings and for equipment. Part 65 defines the requirements for personnel. Part 91, 119, 121, 125, and 135 are going to give us operation and certification requirements. Part 145 and 147 are going to define the requirements for repair stations and for technical schools. And then Part 183 defines who in the private sector can be designated to represent the FAA. Thank you.